Every mind lives inside a boundary it cannot see. We understand the world from the place we touch it, and we assume the rest must be like the part we know. Most arguments, philosophical, religious, political, are born not from lies, but from this invisible limit of perspective. One of the oldest parables in human storytelling, The Blind Men and the Elephant, stages this problem with perfect clarity. It is more than a fable about error. It is a model of how knowledge breaks, how it can be repaired, and why perspective alone is never enough. They had heard the rumors. A vast creature, an elephant, brought to the palace courtyard, unlike any animal they had ever known. 6 blind men were led there together, curious and unafraid, eager to discover what sighted people spoke of with such wonder. Each reached forward, hands searching in darkness, hoping to understand the thing before them by touch alone. One man's palms met a broad, still surface, firm, warm, and towering above him. "Ah," he said with satisfaction, "an elephant is like a wall." Another, exploring farther ahead, grasped something long and flexible, alive with movement in his hands. "You are mistaken," he said confidently. "An elephant is a snake." The others, hearing this, reached for truth in their own way. One found a tusk, smooth and tapering to a point. "A spear," he declared. Another wrapped his arms around a thick pillar of muscle and bone. "No, a tree." "You're all wrong." A fifth brushed against something wide and thin and fluttering. "A fan," he insisted. The sixth held the tail and laughed at them all. "You fools, it's nothing but a rope." And so they argued, loudly, earnestly, each man certain that what he touched was the whole. Their voices rose not because they were liars, but because each believed the others must be blind in a way deeper than blindness. Blind to the truth he himself had felt. The quarrel might have gone on forever had the king not stepped forward. He had been watching in silence, amused at first, then saddened by the stubbornness unfolding before him. "You are all right," he said, "and all of you are wrong." The men fell quiet. "Each of you touched only one part of the animal. Not one of you has grasped the whole. The elephant is all of those things, and more." A long stillness followed, broken only by the sound of the great creature breathing. Slowly the men understood: the wall-like side, the snake-like trunk, the spear-sharp tusk, the tree-thick leg, the fan-broad ear, the rope-thin tail. None of them false, all of them incomplete. Only then, when they began sharing what they had learned, did the shape of the unseen animal finally begin to take form in their minds. In many traditional tellings, this story is not just about misperception, but epistemic humility. One common interpretation likens each man's perspective to a religious or philosophical system, each groping toward truth, each incomplete. Jain philosophy explicitly uses this tale to illustrate Anekantavada, the doctrine that reality is complex and many-sided. No single statement about it can claim absolute truth. Buddhist and Hindu retellings sometimes emphasize the illusory certainty of the senses and the need for transcendental insight. In some theistic readings, the king represents divine omniscience, the only one who can see the entire elephant. Whether the emphasis is pluralism, humility, or metaphysical hierarchy, the moral is clear. No one has a monopoly on truth, and conflict arises when partial truths are mistaken for the whole. But this parable is not just a warning, it is a map. It traces how understanding fragments, how it can be repaired, and what principles govern the movement from partiality toward integration. These are precisely the movements modeled by logical triads, in which 3 interacting elements represent distinct but interdependent cognitive states. Each triad expresses a dynamic relation. One element may affirm another, negate it, or reconcile their opposition in a higher synthesis. Together, these relations form the grammar of change within thought itself, how perspectives compete, stabilize, or converge. A triad, then, is not a formula of mere logic, but a living structure of cognition. It models how ideas behave when they meet, how one position gives rise to its counterposition, and how both can evolve into a more encompassing view. Every triad contains both an affirmative mode, in which understanding expands through cooperation, and a negative mode, in which it contracts through resistance. Through this lens, the elephant story ceases to be a simple fable about blindness and becomes a diagram of epistemic motion, a cycle in which perception, conflict, and synthesis follow one another according to intelligible laws. In the opening moment of the story, each blind man encounters a different part of the elephant and forms a conclusion based on his own limited experience. No one is lying and no one is delusional. Each man's description is true within the narrow boundary of his contact. This is the state of coexistence. Multiple partial truths living beside one another without yet recognizing their shared origin. This is the level emphasized most clearly in Jain philosophy, which teaches that every viewpoint expresses only one side of a multifaceted reality. The coexistence phase is not yet conflict, because no one has tried to universalize his own perception. They simply stand in parallel, each holding his own truth. The lesson here is not that disagreement is wrong, but that perspective itself is inherently bounded, and truth begins as plurality, not singularity. The moment the men stop merely reporting what they felt and begin insisting that their view is the only correct one, the story enters a state of tense equilibrium. The balance here is not harmony, but standoff. Each man negates the others, and the dispute escalates, not because any of them suddenly knows less, but because they refuse to accept that others know anything at all. This negative equilibrium mirrors the rigid dogmatism found in religious and philosophical conflicts throughout history, the very interpretation the parable is most widely used to critique. Instead of learning from one another, the men begin defending their fragment as the whole. The lesson is clear. Truth can be frozen into conflict when people mistake a partial experience for the complete picture and refuse to grant validity to alternative accounts. The cycle turns when the men begin to recognize the limits of their own certainty. Once one man admits, "I only felt the tail," it becomes possible for another to say, "And I only felt the ear." This mutual acknowledgement allows their perspectives to become additive rather than competitive. Each incomplete truth begins to support the others, revealing something greater than any single man could know alone. This is the moral underlying the more pluralistic interpretations of the story. Not only that humility is necessary, but that perspectives can strengthen one another when they are not treated as enemies. Reinforcement is the first step toward integration, where one truth does not erase another, but instead extends it. Before the king intervenes, however, the opposite kind of reinforcement takes place. A negative feedback cycle where rejection fuels more rejection. One man's certainty provokes another's defensiveness, which provokes louder certainty in return. Instead of building a shared understanding, their reactions amplify misunderstanding. This is how arguments based on fragmentary truth become self-feeding loops of error. This phase is not about ignorance alone, but about the psychology of certainty. The more someone clings to their partial view, the more they must deny every other view to protect it. Many religious critics use this story in exactly this way, not to condemn belief, but to expose the way conviction can harden into blindness. Once perception, interpretation, and belief begin to chain together, the story demonstrates how a single limited encounter can generate a full-blown worldview. Touching a trunk becomes an elephant is a snake. Touching a leg becomes an elephant is like a tree. A tiny access point produces a sweeping conclusion. This is the stage where the mind moves from experience to theory, and it reveals how easily mistaken causation forms. I felt this, therefore reality is this. Ancient Indian versions of the story repeatedly use this causal jump to warn against the naive assumption that personal experience equals universal truth. The lesson is not that perception is worthless, but that interpretation is always one step beyond sensation, and therefore more error-prone. The conflict stops only when a higher perspective interrupts the closed loop of certainty. In the parable, that perspective is voiced by the king, but in different interpretations it can represent divine omniscience, awakened consciousness, or philosophical synthesis. His correction forces each man to reverse the chain of reasoning that led from touch to dogma. Instead of "I felt this, so reality is this," the logic becomes, "Since others also perceived something true, my belief must be incomplete." This stage expresses the necessary undoing of false certainty, not a rejection of experience, but a return to its limited beginning, now viewed honestly rather than absolutistically. The story teaches that reversion is not regression, but the beginning of wisdom. When all the men finally acknowledge that each one had a piece of the truth, the full picture emerges. The elephant is none of the things they named, and yet contains all of them. This is the moment of harmonic integration, where truths do not compete, but resonate. In this state, perspectives no longer stand alone as fragments, but cooperate as components of a larger whole. This is the outcome that the Jain version of the parable celebrates most explicitly, and the outcome that modern interfaith dialogue takes from the story. Truths can converge without erasing difference. Harmony does not mean everyone now thinks the same. It means everyone now understands how the pieces fit together. The opposite state, the one the story warns against, is dissonance, a condition in which every person's certainty prevents every other person's truth from being heard. In this phase, the ignorance of one becomes the ignorance of all. What makes this stage dangerous is not that each person knows too little, but that each believes he already knows enough. The parable uses this dissonance as a cautionary structure. If no integrating voice, whether king, wisdom, or humility, intervenes, the men would remain forever divided, sure of themselves and wrong about the world. Dissonance, then, is not a lack of truth, but a refusal to let truths meet. The parable ultimately shows that truth is not an illusion, but a partial possession. Each blind man is right about what he touched, yet wrong in believing his experience exhausts the whole. The story does not challenge the existence of truth, only the assumption that any single perspective can claim it fully. Knowledge begins in fragments, not certainties, which means that every assertion, no matter how confident, is born inside a boundary. What appears as error often isn't falsehood, but incompleteness misinterpreted as totality. The conflict in the story does not arise from difference itself, but from the absolutizing of difference. As soon as each man elevates his perception into a universal claim, the situation shifts from parallel perspectives to combative ones. Dogma is not produced by ignorance, but by the refusal to admit the limits of one's knowing. The turning point, the moment learning resumes, is not when someone gains new information, but when someone says, "I may not have the whole picture." In that moment, humility stops being a moral posture and becomes a cognitive strategy, a way to reopen pathways that certainty has closed. What the king provides is not extra data, but a meta-perspective, the frame in which all partial truths can be seen as complementary rather than competitive. The blind men could not arrive there from within their closed loop of self-reference. An external reconciling view had to intervene. This reveals a final lesson. Perspectives may coexist, collide, or converge, but they do not integrate themselves automatically. Integration requires either a mediator, a higher framework, or a shift in consciousness equal to stepping outside the argument. That is why the parable continues to serve not just as a religious metaphor, but as a model for logic, dialogue, psychology, and systems thinking. It is a story not just about what truth is, but about how truth behaves when multiplied across minds, a lived demonstration of triadic cognition, where every viewpoint is a node, every clash a relation, and every act of synthesis a transformation in the structure of understanding.